One of the ways many of us relax is to watch movies or films. But it even gets better when these movies or films are in our indigenous language and we're able to identify with it and understand it better. Well, that is the focus of our conversation today, and I welcome all of you. My name is Grace Hamwajiman, and this episode promises to be an interesting one. I'll introduce my guest. As always, after this break, stay with us.
Welcome to Africa's LSP podcast, where we explore the world of translation, interpretation, and localization, as well as connect with the language industry's top players. From language service providers to the businesses and individuals who rely on their services, we'll be delving into the challenges, opportunities, and trends shaping the industry. Join us as we discover the power of language and the impact it has on connecting Africa and the world. Brought to you by Bolingo Consult, Africa's LSP podcast is the go-to podcast for all things language in Africa.
Welcome back. Omusula Omuholo, forgive me if I didn't mention the name right, is a PhD candidate at the School of Journalism and Communication, University of Oregon, and she's helping us talk about indigenizing cultural identity within films with language as a mediating element. Hello, madam. Welcome to the LSP podcast, and we are honored to have you on our show. So apart from this beautiful smile on your face that I only get the privilege to see, what more do you want us to know about Omusula? Who you are, where you're from, where you're based, what you do, and all the interesting things that we need to know about yourself, especially about your studies or professional life.
Thank you so much, Grace, for having me on the Africa's LSP podcast. It's such a great honor to be here. Yeah. My name is Omusula Omuholo, and I'm from Kenya. Kenya is in East Africa, and I speak Luya, or I'm from the Luya community, which is a part of the larger Bantu language that where most of our African languages borrowed dialects or have similar languages here and there when we talk. Yeah, and I come from a place called Mumias, which is towards the border of Kenya and Uganda, and also very close to Lake Victoria. Yeah, so a little bit about the meaning of my name, Omusula. When I first came to Ghana, for personal reasons and also as an exchange student and attending a youth exchange program, I met somebody who asked me what was my name, and I said Winfred, and they asked me, "What is your name?" And I said, "Winfred, I think I already told you what my name is." And they said, "What is your African name?" And I said, Omusula Omuholo. And they said, "Yeah, that is your African identity." And then it's then compelled me to actually find out what my name meant. And I learned that my name meant the uprooted one. So I'm constantly derive my life in such a way that I'm moving from one place to the other, gaining knowledge and sharing the knowledge that I gain from other places, moving from one place. Maybe one time, who knows, I'll eventually land in a place where I'll now say, okay, we are not uprooting anymore. This is where we're going to be. So I'm currently a student at the University of Oregon and doing my doctoral program in communication and media studies. Yeah.
Wow, names, they say, have an impact on the bearer, and indeed, the story of your movement and your travels reflects just that. Omusula, the uprooted one. Great. So, as part of your PhD studies at the University of Oregon, you're conducting research into indigenizing cultural identity within films. Can you tell us more about this research and what motivated you to go into this area?
Thank you so much, Grace, once again. Currently, I'm researching indigenization of cultural identity within globalization, focusing on films. films, which is part of media. I say currently because my broader research interest is actually the field of intercultural communication, cultural studies, and the political economy of indigenous language media. And so for my current research, I base it on these key concepts, which include globalization, indigenization, indigenization, indigenous language, cultural identity, and the media, which is the films that I engage in my research work. Just to explain my research, it discusses audience evaluation of indigenous language use in the representation of cultural identity in films. And I know this might sound quite broad or ambiguous, so specifically, I engaged 2 films about the Zulu people to understand this evaluation of indigenous language use. In that both films document the culture of the Zulu people of South Africa and their great king Shaka Zulu's life. I don't know whether when you grew up you read stories or heard stories about Shaka Zulu. I grew up mesmerized about his mother Nandi, and at some point I even thought that when I get a child, whether male or female, I would name them Nandi because I liked the character Nandi and how she showed herself in the Shaka Zulu film. So these 2 films, one of them uses English and is called Shaka Zulu, and the other one uses isiZulu and it's called Shaka Ilembe. So the Shaka Zulu is the first production, and the Shaka Ilembe is a recent production it's hosted by DSTV on Mzansi Magic TV.
Tell me, what fascinates you so much about Shaka Zulu? It looks like he's had a lot of influence on your research work.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by Shaka Zulu because is when we are learning about heroes in Africa, one of those historical heroes include people like Shaka Zulu. Amongst the Luo people, we have Luanda Magere, and then we also have when we are discussing about Kenyan politics and colonization, we have a lot of people like the king of the Wanga, Nabongo Mumia. We have when they're fighting about rebellion, we have all these African historical leaders that showed a lot of prowess and power in fighting for our people and fighting for our cultures. Yeah. So that's why I'm very much fascinated about Shaka Zulu. And like I said, the character Nandi, I love that character. Yeah. And so what motivates me to do this research? So there's a host of events that when I think about or when I remember, bring together why I actually decided to carry out this research. And they involved my encounters both in Kenya and Ghana. And I'll just explain like 3 of these events. So while in Ghana, I was making efforts to integrate, and I constantly found myself in situations where I had to use the local language. So, like in marketplaces, in the trotro, and when I'm engaging with the hajia seller who does the cocoa and the wache, and we cannot have a conversation unless I speak the language. So that is one of the things that enabled me to immerse myself into the Ghanaian culture and try to understand and interact with Ghanaians. Yeah. The other event or the other thing that motivated me was I got a chance to work as a language researcher with Bolingo Consult, and we organized the African Languages Conferences in that year, and I was hosting Obenfo Obadele Kambon, a professor at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, and I was mesmerized by how he was able to move from one African language to another, like in literally he would speak something in Swahili, then he would say something in Chi, then he would say something in another African language. And it made me realize that we needed, there was an urgency in us moving from thinking that not speaking your indigenous African language meant that you were not knowledgeable or you were not as good as somebody who spoke the foreign languages like English, French, and all those other languages that we are encouraged to study and add to our CVs. Not that those other languages are bad, but it made me realize that it was very important, and it was very it was going to give us a lot of power to also be able to add our indigenous languages to this pool of foreign languages that we speak. Yeah. And the third motivation was one time I was just browsing through my DSTV, and then I saw this Shaka Ilembe, and I was so mesmerized, and I was like, and I said, let me see what's going on here, and only to discover that this is a whole production by Africans done in the indigenous African language, that is done in the isiZulu language, and they are speaking the isiZulu, and the production is so good. It's so highly rated. You can actually find it online. That is one of the very highly rated African films, globally, actually. So that really caught me because, of course, there have been African films done in the indigenous language, but the trajectory of this one was absolutely different. And you could see that this is a film that could actually win an international award because it checked all the boxes of the expectations of the international film awards. Well, according to me, I don't know about other people. Yeah, so those are some of the initial main things that got me into being interested and being motivated into doing research that involve indigenous language, globalization, and the how it's used in cultural identity in films. Well, Grace, another thing that I have to mention, which is very important as part of the things that motivated me to do this research, is that while working, I having the privilege to work as a language researcher, where in a media industry, in a media company that was very concerned about the use of indigenous languages in localization. I observed a continued dominance of foreign language through globalization, and this you can bear me witness, Grace, that we have glorified other foreign languages as opposed to also glorifying our own indigenous languages, because we don't feel like our languages are at the same category as these foreign languages. I cannot say that those are just my observations, but I think generally in the space of language use, that is one of the things that comes out very prominently. And then the other thing is that the dominance of foreign languages in our daily interaction actually results in social exclusiveness from certain discourses. We cannot assume that when we are having a discussion on, say, maternal health, for example, tell me how you're going to have a discussion about maternal health in English, and you expect that somebody in the village who does not speak English will be able to be part of this conversation. It's impossible. And that's why the use of indigenous languages in films actually speaks into involving other people, involving the local people, involving people from back in our villages who don't speak the language, to actually be part of discussing issues that affect the society, such as our politics, our economy, and other social issues. I'm going to do a special mention of Dr. Zippy Okoth, who is a professor from Kenya, who has done a very tremendous job with her recently released film Otis Janam, which she produces this film in the Luo language, and the film touches on very key societal issues such as feminism, the gender equality, politics, and all these topics that we always assume that we talk about them in English and we assume that the local people, it takes away, it separates the local people because they're now not able to get involved. But when this film is used in Luo, it's very interesting how the concept of feminism is actually discussed using the Luo language. And then now it's easy for one to understand what is feminism or what is gender, what is gender, what is politics, but based on your indigenous language. And yeah. And so because of this dominance of foreign language, it leads to our loss of languages. And you'll bear me witness, Grace, that you know that when we were growing up and we were going to school and we had the disc, and you were being told that if you speak your local language, that you're going to be given a disc. That was very disgraceful, and I'm glad that we are coming out of it because that was a very colonial mindset. And now that we are discovering that there is nothing absolutely wrong with you speaking your indigenous language alongside speaking the foreign language, it's not going to make you any less of knowledgeable, or it's not going to make you any less of a person. If you can, there's actually people who have a lot of wealth of knowledge, but they can only express that knowledge in their indigenous language. So do we water them down just because they don't speak they cannot speak the English language or the other foreign languages? And that's why this I was motivated to do this research so that it would contribute in, one way or the other, us not losing our languages and not losing our cultures, to, see how we can use the indigenous language to actually say what we want people to see in that global space.
Wow. You had a lot of reasons, and it is good you took it upon yourself to undertake this research. And that example you cited of how children are prevented from speaking their local language. Even in schools, we had people who were writing names of those who spoke their local language and were punished. So thank you for sharing that deep insight into it and also bringing it and telling us about the strong conviction behind the research. Let us now take the opportunity to understand the key concept, indigenizing cultural identity. What exactly do you mean by indigenizing cultural identity?
The key concept here is indigenizing cultural identity. And it sounds too academic. So I hope that I can break it down into something that we all can understand, because it's not that complex when we explain it. So indigenizing cultural identity simply means repossession of traditional and customary identity. And if you remember in the conversations before this, I spoke about the loss of our cultural identity through the dominance of foreign languages. And you would agree with me, Grace, that in Africa, our value is our culture, and we need to repossess our identities. And how best to do this other than to use indigenous languages? And this is why indigenization is the key context of my research, if I might say. Again, indigenization of cultural identity refers to African Renaissance. I don't know whether you understand African Renaissance, but that is to assert our belonging to our African traditional values and social relations in all aspects of our lives, even as globalization proceeds unabated across the world. What do I mean here is that we really do not need to change anything to fit into any structure, or to think that we are not fit to be called global just because I choose to live my life in a certain way. I'm gonna make a very very simple example of the Chinese, Japanese, that despite them being very advanced in their technology and fitting into the global space, you would realize that they still stick to their cultures. Like this new inventions and this new issues that come up in the globe or in globalization did not in any way affect how they indigenously represent themselves. And that is exactly what I am trying to do in my research work, to continuously encourage us to not shy away from indigenizing our cultural identity, be who we are, such that technologies do not affect what we feel like about ourselves or what we believe our identities are as an African people. And in all this re-engagement with our cultures, it means that we then need to re-emphasize the use of African languages in social and academic interactions. And in my explanation before this, I did make an emphasis again that when we lose our language, then we lose our culture. And that's why it's very important to indigenize and to use indigenous languages in in representing our cultures, because there are certain parts of our cultures that can only be explained if we use our indigenous languages. And when we change it into the foreign language, it may slightly water away the meanings of these things. That's just what I mean in short.
Indeed, when we lose our language, we lose our culture, and we don't want to get to the place where we have lost our self-identity and who we are. So, Omusula, you initially mentioned the two films you had chosen to use. Talk to us a bit more about it and if you engaged other popular African films as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Grace, again. I actually captured this above whilst I was explaining my research focus, but well, I'll still talk about the two films. So the two films that I engage with are Shaka Zulu, which is produced in English, and Shaka Ilembe, which is produced in isiZulu. Both films actually talk about the Zulu people's culture, and they tell of the story of the historical stories of Shaka Zulu, who is a heroic figure amongst the Zulu people. You know, when you're talking about the Zulu people, you cannot miss to talk about Shaka Zulu and how he helped them to fight the colonial powers. Yeah. So aside from this, I actually engage other globally acclaimed films that attempt to represent African cultures, like The Black Panther, The Woman King, amongst other films, to better analyze the two core films that I focus on, because it is important to actually see what do other films say about African cultures and what representations are given, and do these representations also reflect on how we make the representations of culture and our identities in the films that we produced by ourselves in the continent?
How did you choose these two specific films to represent Zulu cultural identity within a globalized context?
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace. My first stop to sample films with cultural representations was DSTV. And why DSTV? Because we realized that DSTV is a globally recognized subscription based media company that showcases, among other things, productions done in the indigenous African languages, as well as representing African cultures. Yeah. When you go to the DSTV, they have packages that fit different audiences, and we are very. It's a very good thing that now a lot more African countries are being represented through different packages on DSTV. Then we have like Maisha Magic from Kenya. You get a lot of productions there done in Kiswahili and sometimes in the indigenous languages in Kenya. We have Mzansi Magic in South Africa, where I was able to watch the Shaka Ilembe film, amongst others, the Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, and lately I saw that there's a Kwaba, which also represents the Ghanaian productions. And this is a really good space to go and sample films that are showcasing African cultures, because we are getting to a place where we want to tell our stories the way that we want people to see them. So Shaka Ilembe fit my research focus, and because I had already watched the Shaka Zulu story from a rented cassette, I didn't think too much about it, but I rather had to find it in a digital space so that I could now use it for my research work as opposed to looking for cassette because I couldn't get access to the cassettes at that time. You know, the rented cassettes is one of the ways in which we used to watch our films back in the day. You know, my father used to buy us lots of cassettes. One time, he is actually a teacher. A Kiswahili teacher, to be precise. So you understand where the whole idea of languages comes from. You know, I have a person that has already done it, and you know, I'm literally just following in the footsteps. And so one time when he went to mark the national examinations, you know what you have in Ghana as WAEC, we have it in Kenya as the Kenya Certificate of Secondary Education, where we do the national exams and then we have teachers go and mark. Yeah, so my father got some money from this job and bought a DVD player. Yes, what it looks similar to what we now have as the DSTV decoders, but this one you had to input a cassette in it. You know, a very big cassette, almost looks like a book, standard book size. And then those are the cassettes that we used to watch back in the day. And so it's appreciative that DST provides a platform where we do not now have to go to the cassettes, but we can access these films in a digital platform. All you have to do is to subscribe, and that's exactly what I did in that case. Yeah. And then, secondly, after picking out the films, I had to check whether these films really, beyond DSTV, can actually be watched by other people. You know, so there is on the internet we have the Internet Movie Database, IMDb in short, which is a platform for rating films. So like if you want to watch a film and you want to see how highly rated it is, then you use the platform to do that. And so I checked the platform and it always also has people who give reviews about the films. And so you decide whether this is something that you want to spend your time on or you don't want to spend your time on it. And so I found that these two films were highly rated and I was convinced that I would use them for my research focus or for my research work. And besides that, the films themselves symbolize, if you like, the contestations, connections, contradictions, convergences between modernity and tradition, globalization and indigenization. What I mean is that depending on the way you would analyze them, these films can mean different connections between indigenization and globalization, you know. But for me, what I mean is that South Africa as a society, which is the context of the film, exhibits in some sense a modernized society. Yet these films go down into the history and core traditions of the Zulu people. So you see, in these films, we can see contestations, connections, contradictions, convergences between globalization and indigenization, you know, in the way that all these things are represented just by the use of the language that is used in representing the cultural identities of the South African people. I mean, the Zulu people that my research is actually focused on.
Wow, Omusala, I must say that you have put in so much effort into this research. And so tell us what you expect to achieve with this research, especially its relevance to the film industry, as well as its contribution in preserving African languages and culture.
Yeah, it's quite a long question with
Yeah, I know it's a loaded question.
what I hope to achieve can be categorized in two ways. First one is conceptually, and if you like, practically. So I'll start with the conceptual, the conceptual part. My desire is to reconstruct the relationship between indigenization and globalization. Normally, we when we are discussing indigenization, we try to put it different from globalization, but that is not the case. They, in fact, go hand in hand. The very purpose, one of the reasons why we have globalization is because we have indigenization. We have people with different identities trying to be in one platform or trying to be on one level. You know, I come as a Kenyan, you come as a Ghanaian, another person comes as a Zimbabwean, another one comes as a in the case of Africa, and we call ourselves, give ourselves a certain name. We are African. You understand? And then the aspect of globalization now means we bring and pull out all these parts that represent us and show people this is who we are. We are working with you, but this is who we are. We do not want to change who we are so that we fit in a space. But we are going to come with our uniqueness to fit in that space. And that's exactly what indigenization is about, those unique characters that actually make us have such fields as intercultural communication, international communication, globalization. So how do we work around each other with all this uniqueness? That's basically it. So it is very important for me, as well as other researchers, to find and reconstruct these relationships in our research work. And my expectation in this research is that globalization should not necessarily inhibit indigenization. Not at all. You do not have to forego of the things that you believe in so that you're seen to be globalized. Not at all. I expect that Zulu audiences of these films are highly integrated in the global world. Yet, I also expect their evaluation to assert that the film in their indigenous language better expresses their cultural values than the film in English. That's as far as I am assuming, And the reason why I have to go out and do research so that we find out what exactly is it. I mean, is that it, or is that not it? And because this I'm just in the process of my research work, I may not give an elaborate explanation about the conceptualization or the conceptual frameworks. And through my research, I really do seek to reconstruct this context and this notion, and to see how we can still be Africans but fit in the specs of globalization, or the structures that actually define what globalization is. Because I do believe that in our uniqueness, we can still be able to fit and not have to change anything. Let's take, for example, countries like China. One of the examples that I will use may not be a perfect one, but still, China, Korea, we watch Korean films and we have them showcasing their cultures, their identities, and still they're also very technologically savvy. So it means that for us to actually fit in a globalized world, we do not in any way have to change anything. One of the things that also countries like China, Japan have done is to actually use their languages to interpret these technological works, or these technological issues, so that the local people can understand them, so that you can actually go into their platforms and you see everything is written in the Chinese. I would love for a time when we have that kind of thing in Africa, when we're using the African languages to actually understand these technological words, because those words are there. We just need to work on them and find them, and which is why such research as what I am doing is very important, so that we continuously encourage ourselves to know that we can be cultural, we can keep our cultural identities and still fit in the globalized world without having to change anything at all. When we go to the practicality of the research. I expect to pose significant relevance to the film industry because based on the expected results of my research, I can talk about films to be encouraged to maintain, because we are already using those indigenous languages, to maintain that trajectory and use these languages to actually bring or share cultural representations. And so in short, what I mean to say is that I seek to contest the notion that we cannot be ourselves anymore in globalization. We really can still be ourselves and still fit into globalization. So the practicality of it is very important because there's no point of doing research and have it packed in the libraries gathering dust when it cannot be practical to the society. And that's why I want to involve the audiences. I want to listen from my research focus. I want to listen to what the audience have to say about how these languages are used to represent their cultures. Yeah, instead of just watching the film and making an analysis of it, why not engage the audience whose culture is being represented and let them tell you what they think or what they feel about how the use of the isiZulu language is actually used to represent cultural identities of the Zulu people. Another thing, Grace, one of the things you have asked is what contribution does my research work make in preserving African languages and culture? Generally, having worked in the localization industry, that is the language and localization industry, as a language researcher, there are several ways in which language can be preserved, and one of them, which is the latest, is using artificial intelligence. But see, the thing is, the artificial intelligence cannot work without the humans. And even though we are going to go to a digital space where we are going to use AI a lot, we are going to supplement it using humanity. And how do we do this? Films is one of the ways that we can do that. Films are very as important a medium in the documentation of cultures as it is important to have them documented in books, written in books. But when it comes to stuff like language, you want to listen, you want to hear, you want to get the pronunciations right. How do we store these things? There are people who would prefer to listen to music about and pronunciations of languages through music. Other people would want to do it through films. And I want to mention a few people that I think have made a great contribution to the preservation of languages, the indigenous African languages. One of them is Katrina Ouma from South Africa, who has documented the Zulu language. Forgive me for that pronunciation because I'm not very sure about the pronunciation, but it's there is Zulu, something like that, language that is at the verge of extinction. And she recently received an award from the South African government. Such steps are very, very good. Another one is Ken Bosire from Kenya, who is working on documenting the Kisi language, creating a dictionary of the Kisi language. But then, it's one thing for these languages to be in a dictionary. It's another thing for us to be actually able to see them in action. And what a better way than to see the actions in films, because then the films will actually put the languages into the perspective of cultural representation, because now we get to see the cultures and the cultural identities being represented using the language. Yeah. So you know that when you're dealing with when you're trying to film the concept of I'll take, for example, the concept of gender and representation within the African society. And then you have such concepts shown in you have such concepts shown using indigenous languages. It's very easy for people to either defend or say that no, you're headed in the wrong direction or the right direction. And that's just basically one of the ways that I know that my research work will contribute in preserving African languages and cultures, connecting the films, the indigenous languages and the media, all of them coming together to help us continue to have our cultures and identities represented in the right way, but still make us globally relevant. Yeah.
Most definitely. We'll have you back on this show to tell us what you gathered. We cannot afford to lose out on the details of the findings. So, this research at the end of the day centers on how essential it is to use the indigenous language. What do you think is the significance of indigenous language for cultural identity? You have mentioned most of them in passing in your answers, but let's go a bit deeper into that.
Great. Let's take symbolic interactionism theory. This is one of the theories that I engage with in my research work to understand the importance of language and language use for cultural identity. Language with its symbols is key in formulating and expressing meaning of the world. And because of this, the meaning of our world as Africans can only be expressed adequately in our own languages. Our language is our identity, our belonging, and the anchor of our civilization. I'll give a very recent example of how language becomes very important for cultural identity. When you're as Ghanaians, this is a very controversial example, and it's meant for the laughter, but take it also very seriously. I am in my program. We have the Ghanaian students, and a lot of times I'm always hanging out with them. And there is just this way when they are talking, when they begin talking, and they will find themselves forgetting that there's a Kenyan amongst them, and begin to talk begin to discuss a topic in the Ghanaian language. At this moment, that's where they're actually appreciating their identity as Ghanaians. Their intention is not to leave me out, but that is when they're most comfortable to express that topic in their language, because then it will not make sense. Like, there are things that you want to say, you cannot say it in another foreign language apart from your own. And you see that moment when you're actually picking to say something in your own language to another person who also understands the same thing, because you understand the context of it, and the context can only be understood when you speak that language. There is your cultural identity. There's no other way for me to debate that you're now using your indigenous language to actually create the significance of your cultural identity. You get it? Can you imagine us talking about the stew, the golden stew in English? No, we'll find ourselves getting into the nitty-gritties of the golden stew, using the Akan languages and how those languages actually express the importance of that stool within the Akan people's culture. You get it? So that's absolutely it. So I do not know if there is any better way that I would show the language and its cultural, how important it is in cultural identity. If you do not put it in context, there are times when whatever you do, you'll have to use your language to put it in context. And that is exactly the place where your cultural identity shows up. So when I actually meet my Swahili people and I'm hanging out with my Ghanaian friends, oh no, I do the payback really good. I know how to do payback. And I like how one of my colleagues first always go like, Omusula, what did he just say? And I said, see, I would love to translate this into a language you can understand, but it will not make any sense if I move it from the Kiswahili and bring it to the language that you understand. So that's absolutely what indigenous languages do to help us to actually show our cultural identities.
I definitely agree with you on that payback bit. It's you do me, I do you. And I totally support you to do that. And also, that Ghanaian example you gave reminds me of the episode we had with Colin, Angela, and the rest of the team on the prevalence of the Ghanaian language and how it impacts on employment in the job market. So if you haven't listened to that episode, please go back and do that. It will do you a lot of good. Thank you so much, Omusula. Thank you so much for sharing this. Tell us what your take is about the relationship between indigenizing cultural identities and globalization. Are they mutually exclusive or complementary? And why would you choose any of the sides?
Well, it appears this particular part of the conversation, the indigenization of cultural identities and globalization must mean so much for you to, continuously have me talk about it. And I'm enjoying it. I love it. You could ask me 1,000 times, I would still talk about it, In all the conversations that we've had up to now, I have tried to speak about indigenization and globalization. But, well, let's still talk about it. We'll probably have people who are coming in late and start from here, then they go up and now say, oh, what else was said up there? So let's do this. Indigenization and globalization are not conflictive, but rather complementary and mutually enhance each other. Why do I say this? Because globalization is about appreciation of and interaction with different cultures. Just as I explained, all our cultures, we are unique in the way that we express who we are and how we want people to see us. And we do not want this to be taken away from us in the name of globalization. And that is why we cannot separate globalization and indigenization of cultural identities and make them two. They work together. They go hand in hand. In a nutshell, to interact convincingly, one must know themselves first very well to understand and appreciate the other person. You can't tell me that you are going to be able to have a conversation with a French man and not be able to uniquely exist on your own or represent yourself such that the Frenchman will still see you speaking French but look at you differently. Like there's something different about how you speak that French, and that's what makes you different from the other person. You get my point? And so, yeah, they can never be mutually exclusive, but they are constantly complementing each other in every stage, in every time we are trying to bring across cultural identities in globalization.
What do you think is the future of the indigenous language used for cultural identity and representation in films about Africa?
First of all, Grace, I would really want to express how proud I am of the efforts that film producers are making in using indigenous languages in their films. Be it just for cultural representations or just be it just using it to just have it there. I find it very, very, very encouraging because we are moving into a space where we are having our children not able to access the indigenous languages in the ways that our parents or our other generations accessed it. And when we have films bring this out, it helps them to practice their indigenous languages, and it also helps in the preservation of these indigenous languages. And so the future is really bright for indigenous languages in films. Like I've just said, there are many more films being done in indigenous languages, a lot of more productions, and such media houses, globally recognized media houses like DSTV, amongst others, are doing such a good deal to have these platforms where producers and can have productions that are done in indigenous languages to represent our cultural identities and, most importantly, to tell our stories. One of the writers, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she expresses this a lot: the fear of telling a one-sided story. And that fear of telling a one-sided story is actually having somebody say your story. How then do you navigate this, or how then do you beat this? Is by also telling your story in the way that you want your story to be told. And what a better way than to do it in your own indigenous language, to represent the things that you want to be shown the way that they are shown, And then generally, I would like to also add that my research emphasizes indigenous language in films, and therefore I consider it contributing to the bright future of indigenous language use for a certain cultural identity and cultural representation in films about Africa. So yes, the future for indigenous language use and cultural identity, if everything in film production is anything to go about or to write home about right now, is really bright, and I can count on it confidently.
What role do audiences play in this, especially on how they can become critical viewers of films portraying African cultures and also engaging with these stories told by Africans themselves?
Thank you so much, Grace. I've enjoyed myself right from the beginning. And this question you ask is very important. First of all, we use films as mirrors of the society, as a place where we can sit down and look at what is presented to us and say, is this what is happening in our society? Does this really represent what our society is? And so film audiences are like the eye and are a capital for films. And without them, films are just empty images, because who would you create the films for if you do not have audiences to actually look at these films and give you feedback about the films that you make? So audiences are very important in that aspect. When we look at it critically, audiences can actually analyze films based on their values in various senses, cultural, economic, social, environmental, political, spiritual, amongst others. And production houses have to do the work to make sure that they have in-depth research about the society that they intend to reproduce in their films. And when we have audience having evaluations and engaging with these productions, then this engagement must be part of the conceptual description of the film. And it's very, very important. And to stretch this point just a little bit, the viewers themselves must engage deeply and live within their indigenous cultures to understand and critique films about themselves. It's one thing to actually look at a film and say, oh, wonderful, they use their Kan language, I feel represented. It's one thing to do that, and it's another thing to actually look at it and say, okay, you said this to mean this in their Kan language. Wait a minute, there's something here. I think this should have been like this. I remember that in our culture, this is not how this is represented. And which is why it's important for audiences to just go beyond appreciating that your language has been used in a film and go deeper into actually criticizing the use of that language in representing your cultures in the film. So understand, and this can only come from a place of you as a viewer understanding your culture, because you cannot defend this if you do not understand your cultural backgrounds or your identities or where you come from. What am I trying to say? Generally, the media in every country should promote freedom of expression to expand the space for people to express themselves, the things they see about their cultures, and contribute to discourses around films, because films cannot stand on their own without the audiences, or without critic, without researchers, without people, viewers commenting, critiquing, talking about this film. Because actually, one of the things that makes films rate highly is viewership and the interactions on those films. And right now, we even have social media platforms that even makes it more a bigger space. And you cannot have an excuse about it now, because you have a space where you can actually engage with these films in a much more critical way, as opposed to the usual surface way that we've been engaging in films previously. Yeah, and I think that's just about it.
Yes, because here in Ghana, we have a whole industry or production chain called Kumawood, where all the films produced are in the Akan language, the setup, the props, the music, and everything depicting the Akan people and other tribes. And they came in to save the industry when it was inundated with some other cultures some years ago. So the importance of the use of indigenous language and specific cultural practices or specific cultural properties cannot be overemphasized. It's been great talking to you, Omusula. Thank you so much for generously sharing insights with us. Your presence on Africa's Language Service Providers podcast has been truly invaluable, and we'll make sure to provide our listeners with links to your LinkedIn profiles and to sites where they can find more about you. But are you on any of the social media platforms? You want to share with our audiences how they can reach you?
I do have social media platforms where I engage with my mind about issues to do with culture. So I have my blog, The Culture Trail by Omusula. I also have my YouTube channel, The Culture Trail by Omusula. In my YouTube channel, I actually document my experiences with culture, be it food, be it the people that I interact with, be it places that I go to, be it the books that I read, the films that I watch, comment on cultural issues that are projected on the media generally. And sometimes I do also try to cook some of the cultural foods that I encounter in my journey. And for my blog post, I do document a little more detailed commentaries about culture generally. Yeah. And when you meet me on Facebook is a very informal space. Sorry, it's a very informal space for me to interact with my friends and colleagues about, those tiny things that sometimes I come across culturally, and I found just very interesting to talk about. So basically, that's it, and as well as LinkedIn for other stuff that I do, be it workshops, conferences, and just the little works that I do that involve culture and and encouraging us to continuously be proud of our cultural identities, and just be sure that we are okay as we are. You don't really need to change anything.
Yeah. Thank you once again for your time and contribution.
Well, thank you so much, Grace, for having me. This was such an honor. It was really such an honor to be here. I hope that we find another platform where I can actually now come with the results of my research work and we talk about that. Yes, thank you so much.
It's been amazing talking to you, Omusula, and to you, our audience there. Let me just quote a line from what Omusula said. She said, "You are okay just as you are. Your language is beautiful just as you are. Your culture is beautiful just as you are. And you don't need to change anything about yourself." Omusula Omuholo, my guest on the show for this episode. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been another exciting and interesting episode. My name always is Grace Hamwa Ajuman. I'll see you again in another episode. Till we meet again, Bye-bye from all of us here and the team.
Thanks for tuning in to Africa's LSP podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. For feedback or enquiries, reach out to us at podcast@bolingoconsult.com. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite platforms. Until next time, stay curious and keep growing.